Okay, we ready? Wow, I'm actually louder than this morning. Okay, well, hopefully we'll be in a little less of a hurry too, because I'm not trying to squeeze everything into a shorter time. So welcome back. This is a deep dive on AWS Fargate. I'm Abby Fuller. I work in developer relations for AWS. To the person that just tweeted at me that he's on the Abby Fuller truck, yes, it's awesome. I love it. So this is Fargate. Let's see if I can get my clicker to work. OK, we'll use my laptop clicker instead. OK, so first things first, who here is new to containers? Who here is running containers in production? Yeah. OK. So I think something that comes up for me a lot is not only why are people using containers, but also why are they using these orchestration tools? And then I think someone asked a really good question after the session this morning, which is, so I'm using containers already, and I don't understand why I need another tool to help me do that. Why can't I just run the containers myself? Why can't I just stick them on the host and kind of hope for the best? So with containers, I think it's more than just the basics, right? It's more than just kind of making this container and sticking it on an EC2 instance somewhere and hoping for the best. It's a lot more. It's about how many of them you have running, where they're running, how much resources they're using, how do you deploy them, how do you manage them, how do you scale them? How do I have something that keeps me on track when I say, I want a minimum of 2 and I want a maximum of 25. What keeps track of when you should have 2 to 3, and then 3 to 5, and then 3 to 25? What tells you when to stop? What says, hey, I'm out of resources, and I still need to place more containers to meet my minimum? What do I do now? So that's where people are really turning to things like orchestration tools. And containers themselves are really powerful, but there's not much to them. All they are is that wrapper around the process that you're using. You have your libraries, your binaries, everything's all in that one little piece. And you're seeing people move to these containers because it's enabling to do something that they couldn't necessarily do in the same way before, right? That they had to, previously, if you want to deploy your monolith, you have to have one server for each copy of your monolith. That makes it slower to scale, makes it a little bit harder to work with. You end up with what people used to call like spaghetti code, right? Which is where all the pieces are all intertangled, and that to change one piece, you have to change all of the pieces effectively, because you can't separate kind of function A from function B. And that's something that people were really able to solve with microservices. So you have one function, has one job, and then you can scale all those pieces independently. But you don't really want to be doing that all by hand, right? You don't want to be scaling up your services by hand. You don't want to be deploying them by hand. You probably want some sort of automated process to help you. And that's where our orchestration tools come in. And I think the way it started was first in 2012, you had the whole like Docker on EC2 story, where I ran Docker myself. I kind of managed all the pieces myself. Then people said, you know what, this is too much work also. I really like Docker. I really like the format that is containers, but it's still kind of a lot of work. So then we built ECS, and people liked ECS, and then there were some folks that said, so you know what, ECS isn't necessarily what I want to use. I want to use Kubernetes. So now you have the same version of that story with Kubernetes on EC2. People are running a technology that they're really behind, but they don't want to manage all the pieces themselves. So what you're finding really is that the orchestration tools are not quite hitting it for everyone. They're helping, and they're solving some problems, but they're not solving all of the problems. So today we're going to focus on Fargate. So Fargate is pretty much as close as you can get to the people that asked me in between sessions today to kind of containers on demand. So Fargate's available in 4 regions now. It is US East 1, so Virginia. It is in Dublin. It's in Ohio. So Fargate, no infrastructure. So it removes the bottom piece of this, right? So you focus only on your containers and your tasks. You don't focus on the infrastructure at all. So launch really easily, scale really quickly. You manage everything in a way that feels to me kind of Lambda-esque, right? You define everything at the container level instead of Lambda's function level. And then you don't do anything with the underlying resources. You don't do anything with the underlying hosts. This is my favorite Fargate quote. It says, when someone asks you for a sandwich, they aren't asking you to put them in charge of a global sandwich logistics chain. They just want the sandwich. And P.S., the sandwich is Fargate, right? So I don't want to know how you make cheese, or how do I slice turkey the right way, or who grows my tomatoes. I want to just eat the sandwich. And to me, Fargate is that sandwich, right? Is that there were still problems even with orchestration tools that I'm trying to solve. So remember this. Managing a production infrastructure can be really a lot of work, because beyond kind of the orchestration piece, there's still a lot of like hands-on pieces that go into that. And something like ECS makes it a little bit easier. So you see the top level here. ECS takes that part, the scheduling and orchestration and the cluster manager and the placement engine. But what ECS doesn't take over is how do I provision all of the nodes that belong to my cluster? How do I go about making those nodes work in a way that works for me? So like packages that are installed in the host, how many of them I have, when do I need more, when do I need less? Fargate lets you focus on your application. So I had a really nice quote from someone on Twitch yesterday where he said, our job is X, and for them they are working with currency, but anything that's not directly focusing on the currency things that we're working on at work, I don't want to have to think about that, because it's not directly supporting my job. And that's kind of the way I think about Fargate too, right? Which is that it just lets me focus on what makes me different, on what makes me special. It just lets me focus on my application instead of all the pieces that go into it. So instead of provisioning EC2 instances just to run my container-based workload, all I have to think about are the containers. So what does this look like in practice? If you've seen any of my talks before, you might have seen this, and I keep trying to make it prettier, and then I keep giving it up, because despite my best efforts, I'm not a graphic designer. So someday, someone will take pity on me and make a prettier version of this. But this is what your choices end up looking like on AWS. So you have the Amazon Container Services, which have previously also been called ECS, which I realize is confusing, because everything is kind of called ECS, but we're going to sort it out. So you have Amazon Container Services, and then your first step is you pick your orchestration tool. So that's ECS, which is the Amazon version, or in the preview, or once it's in GA, that's EKS. So you're picking the ECS, or you're picking Kubernetes. And then after that, you have a second step, and that's your launch type. And the way to think about launch type in this case is, how much control do I want over my infrastructure? Do I want to manage everything down to the cluster hosts, or do I only want to manage my containers? And that's what that Fargate level is. So from ECS and EKS, I'll be able to choose either EC2, which is the traditional way, so manage your cluster infrastructure, or you can choose the Fargate launch type, which don't manage your cluster infrastructure, only manage your containers. So I think the best way to look at Fargate, honestly, is by jumping back to EC2 mode for a second, so the traditional way of looking at ECS. So how do these pieces map back to the technology that I've been building with my monolith for a while now? So an instance is just a regular EC2 box. So once I register it to my cluster, that's where all my tasks run. A service is that layer that manages and places the task. A task is that wrapper and configuration around my process. So ultimately, that's my container process, plus some Docker options, like the amount of privileges or the flags or some variables or something like that. So in ECS, you're responsible for all three of these pieces. You're responsible for provisioning the instances. You're responsible for writing and defining the services. And you're responsible for the tasks themselves. Instances, you can configure either just through the base ECS optimized AMI, or you can bring your own, or you can do what I used to do and configure it through EC2 user data like you would any other virtual host. Everything else gets configured through the API. So you can either access that directly through the console, or you can go through the CLI. Tasks belong to task definitions. Containers belong to container definitions. So how compute works is pretty flexible. You bring your own instance type. You can pick any combination of resources you like. Works with things like GPUs, reserved instances, spot instances, and good stuff like that. So a lot more flexibility, but also maybe a little bit more thought that goes into it, right? So you have to choose the instance that works for you. You either use the ECS optimized AMI, or you can make your own. But you're responsible ultimately for provisioning and maintaining that underlying cluster infrastructure. Fargate, a little bit different. So you use a lot of the same building blocks. So the same task definition schema, so the document that defines where your container comes from, the resources that it uses, the name of the family that it belongs to. You use the same kinds of APIs, relatively easy migration, so you can run them either side by side in the same cluster, or you can switch back and forth, which we'll talk about a little bit later. and it shares primitives with things with ECS. So in primitives, it means kind of the AWS integration side of things. So VPC or IAM or CloudWatch or CloudTrail, those are all used the same way in ECS mode, in EC2 mode, and in Fargate. I removed a checkbox here, though. So in Fargate mode, I'm not responsible for the instances themselves. The cluster happens on the Amazon side. I'm still responsible for services and tasks, and that's how I define what's running. So the containers that I'm using and all of that good stuff. The instances are not configured by you, but everything else is exactly the same, right? So you're still using the same definitions, which means that I can switch back and forth a little bit more easily. And some of the differences in this case might be that I changed my launch type. With Fargate, we'll talk about it in a second, but it's a different networking mode. So some things to keep in mind, so some differences, but ultimately it comes down to the launch type and requires compatibilities, and you can switch back and forth or run them side by side in the same cluster. Compute works a little bit differently too. So in Fargate, you get 50-ish combinations of CPU and memory, so not quite as flexible as ECS. Doesn't work with things like reserved instances or spot instances right now. You're not responsible for that pool of compute. You just pick the combination of compute that you want. This is the #1 most popular question I get, other than maybe how do I get into the EKS preview. But the #1 most popular question is, OK, so you have ECS and you have Fargate, and how do I know which one I'm supposed to use? And I think the short answer here is it depends on you, and it depends on what you're doing. I think the better way to look at it is how much control are you looking to have? So if I didn't have Fargate around when I was working with ECS in production, but the way that I would do it now is I would probably start with Fargate, because I have to control and kind of fuss with the least amount of things, and I would move to ECS if I needed a level of control that I didn't have in Fargate. For example, if I wanted to build around reserved instances or spot instances, I'd use ECS. And we'll talk about some more of the differences, but ultimately, it depends on you. And I think ultimately what it might end up looking like for some people in production is running both of them side by side. So tasks that you don't kind of need much customization on will be running in Fargate mode, and tasks that you need something like a sidecar container process or a daemon process running on the host, those tasks might stay in EC2 mode. So I think it can look really successful to have both of those running next to each other in the same cluster. A couple of the differences, so obviously the change in networking mode, and we'll talk in more detail about AWS VPC. Only specify container port, there's no host port. No links, only the local loopback, which we'll also talk about, but that's 127.0.0.1 or localhost. No support for ELB Classic, only ALB or NLB, and Windows containers only on EC2 right now, not in Fargate mode. So this is what requires compatibilities is. That basically lets you either say this container is for Fargate, this container is for EC2, or this container is for both. You can have both, and you can use it to switch back and forth. I promised a little bit of a networking, and promise that if you're not into networking, we're not going to go into a ton of detail. But I think it's really important, right, especially when you're changing your networking mode, that you know at least a little bit about what's going on. So hopefully it's not so late in the day that everyone gets sleepy when we talk about networking, but we're going for it. So two kinds of networking that we're going to talk about today, so local networking and external networking. So local networking means that on a single EC2 instance, two components can communicate with each other via the local loopback interface. So again, that's 127.0.0.1 or localhost. That means that you don't have to go through a networking interface like an ENI. You can just communicate directly on that host. So that's local networking. And we're going to talk about how that works in Fargate. External networking means how do I communicate with services that are not part of that same host. So in ECS and Fargate, that means containers that are not part of that same task definition will be on different hosts. That also is the same way that you communicate with an external service like a database. So that means that traffic is most likely routed through your VPC and your subnet. You get two kinds of subnets, either public with an internet gateway or private with no internet gateway, which means that your traffic is routed through a NAT, so network address translation. So in traditional Docker networking, you have three ways to handle this whole communication process. The default is bridge, Docker 0. That's the default. containers that are on the same network can use IP address. Local containers can communicate with -- link. None means no network interface, only the local one. Host maps directly to the host network. So the good news is that there's now a fourth type that we made because we didn't like the other three. So we made our own. And this one is AWS VPC. So the way this works is that with AWS VPC, each task is allocated an ENI, so that elastic networking interface. So containers that are launched as part of the same task can still continue using that local loopback. And then with that ENI allocation comes a private IP, or if you're using Fargate, you can use the public IP if you want also. But those tasks can communicate via the ENI because it's directly, it's a one-to-one mapping. So it simplifies your container networking, makes things a little bit more straightforward. That is currently the only networking type on Fargate. So if you want to use Fargate or if you want to use EC2 mode and switch back and forth, you'll want to look into the AWS VPC mode because that will be required. I think it's a good thing, by the way. It's always a little annoying, I think, to change your networking type into networking is not everyone's favorite topic. I like it. But not everyone's favorite topic, but it enables some really cool things. Because what it's doing is it's moving networking from the EC2 level down to the container level. So you have a mapping between your task and your networking interface, which simplifies the whole networking stack that you're using, which is a little annoying to set up, but incredibly powerful. And it simplifies things in a way that enables you to do a lot more because you have that mapping. So if you're looking to learn more about this, I included some links for you about how it works in Fargate and also just how AWS VPC mode works in general. A couple people have asked how to get the slides, and they'll be posted by Amazon, and also I'll post them myself on my SpeakerDeck account as well. So if you're looking for the links and you were not fast enough to take a picture, that's OK. The links will be in the deck. So a couple of frequently asked questions, so that if this was your question, you don't have to wait in line and ask it afterwards. Number one, can I have both EC2 and Fargate tasks? Yes. So you can either run a hybrid cluster or you can switch back and forth. Tasks can definitely be compatible with both. Another frequently asked one is, how do I exec into a Fargate container? Short answer is that you don't. Exec requires access to the physical host to get into the container the same way that SSH does. That does not work in Fargate. You kind of have two options here. So one, and this is the short-term solution, is that I would stop the Fargate container and then flip it back to EC2 mode, and then I would exec in. I think that brings kind of a bigger discussion up, and that's why do I need to exec into the container? The same reason, and why do I need SSH access? And I think in a lot of cases, that's just the tool that we've been using to solve a problem, which is that I immediately need access to a process that's not behaving the way that I expected in this container. So I want to get access to it right now and see what's currently happening right this very second. So I'm not sure what this would end up looking like or who will end up building it or whether it will be an open source tool or an in-house one. But what I'd like to see instead is a more long-term solution to that question, which is how do I get immediate data from a container without necessarily requiring access to the physical infrastructure? And to me, what that would look like is some kind of tool that I could use to attach to a running container so I could see the process running, the logs running, the output of whatever the container was, what the status was, so that I could debug something on the fly without needing actual access. The other solution is in the interim, which is that I'm not sure everyone has thought about, is that if you're logging directly from your container to somewhere else, you're probably missing logs. And you're actually probably missing the important ones, because you're missing what happens when your container dies. So what happens when your container dies and you didn't expect it to, but your logging is going directly from your container somewhere else? Your logs are now gone, because your container died before it could ship those logs off somewhere else. So what I used to do is pull all the logs off somewhere externally first. So instead of shipping them directly from my container, maybe I map to something like var log messages on my host, and then I use a collector container to send everything back up, which means that even when my container dies, I've gotten all the logs because I was not dependent on my container running properly in order to get them. If you've worked with the Fargate first run wizard, the number one question is, why can't I use my own VPC? The wizard is just for learning. It's just for kind of getting started and playing around with everything. You absolutely can and should, in production, use your own VPC. So the first run wizard that it takes you from that blue box on the Fargate console page, that is for learning and for playing with things and figuring out the concepts. In production, absolutely do use your own VPC. Good. So a couple of little other things to cover. So it is very unlikely, I think, that people in production are doing things from the AWS console at any sort of scale. I think what I use the console for is things like immediate visual feedback. So how do I get something like a graph or an immediate response, or to look at something really quickly, or to, in a lot of cases, to try something for the very first time. So that's what I might use the console for, but in a production environment, I probably want to automate things. And unless you're really good at automating with the browser, you probably don't do your automation this way. So most people use a CLI. So CLIs that I know of for both Fargate and ECS, a lot of them are shared. The first one is the original, so that's the AWS CLI, the official one. It's open source and includes most AWS services. This is what I've used in the past because it meant that I could use a single CLI and use it for every service that I was running. There are also some ECS and Fargate specific ones. The first one is also official. It's called the ECS CLI. It's just for ECS. Its biggest differentiator is that it supports Docker Compose files. So if that's a format that you're really invested in or that you're interested in using, that's the way to get support for those Compose files. There are also some really good unofficial options. So I think my favorite right now is the Fargate CLI, which is made by one of the AWS SAs. His name is John Pignotta. And to me, it feels very Dockery. So I like Fargate run task nginx, Fargate stop task nginx. So it feels very much the CLI kind of feeling that I would expect from Docker, because it's using a lot of very similar language. So that one's really nice. There's also one called Cold Brew. So you have some non-official options in there as well. I think some of the unofficial options are easier to work with. I think the AWS CLI was more powerful for me because I could do everything at once, because probably my deployment process is not just ECS. It's probably ECS plus something else, and that meant that I could install just the AWS CLI and still take care of things like CloudFront validations. So some nice tools out there, whether they're official or unofficial. And I think finally is that the best person to learn from isn't just me or the other developer advocates or developer relations people or evangelists, but it's all the other people in the audience that are just like you, right? So if I can suggest anything, it's join a meetup, join an online community, join an AWS user group. But I see so many posts that are from people on Stack Overflow or something saying, or the AWS forums even being like, hey, I have a question about adding a subnet to my VPC. And then they come back 6 months later and they say, never mind, solved it. And then how does that help anyone else, right? And I know that all of you, because I've seen so many people that have come up to the Twitch booth and here and other sessions and talked to us in the hallways, and they've all had these great ideas, or they're trying to solve these crazy hard bugs, or they're working on these really cool projects. And I want you all to share that. So I think, as Werner said in the keynote this morning, go build, but also I'm going to add one thing to that and say, go build, but also tell me about it. Tell your friends about it. Tell your coworkers about it. Tell people in the meetups and the user groups, because that's how we create an actual community, and that's how we share things, right? Because if I build something in a vacuum by myself, what happens then? So how does someone else in the same room has probably either solved the problem that I'm struggling with or has a really great idea for me? Right? And if I never share that, if I never write about it, if I never blog about it, if I never speak about it, no one will ever know that. So go build. Also go tell us about it. Tons of resources, by the way, if you're looking to get help. So there's 2 Slack channels right now. There's one that's from us, that's official. It's the AWS developers one. If you want to get an invite, you can send me a DM on Twitter, and I've been letting people in. That's my Twitter handle. Make sure that you send your email if you'd like to get access to the Slack. There's another one that's an ECS developers one. That one is community run, not AWS run. And I'll post the URLs. But if you'd like to get into that one, it's a community. So I can't help you, but the community can help you. And there's also a whole squad of people on Twitter and email and social media and at the Twitch booth that are happy to help chat and answer questions, right? So always feel free to tweet me. Always feel free to email me. And the same with any of the other container developer advocates that are here to help you out. So that is all. Like last time, I will be right up there answering questions for as long as y'all want to hang out. So bring me your questions, come hang out, and we won't do questions out loud because there's not enough microphones for everybody. OK, with that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the summit, and I will see you right up here.